The plane soared 35,000 feet above the Atlantic, its engines humming a steady lullaby that had most passengers dozing in their seats. Outside, the night sky was a vast, inky sea, broken only by pinpricks of starlight glinting through the small, oval windows. Inside the dim cabin, Jeremiah Carter sat wide awake, his lanky frame crammed into an economy seat. His worn sneakers nudged the backpack tucked beneath the chair in front of him, stuffed with everything he owned for this trip, his first time flying. At 17, Jeremiah was a long way from Bronzeville, Chicago, where he lived with his grandmother, Martha, in a tiny apartment with creaky floors and a broken elevator. His heart thumped, not from the altitude, but from the weight of what awaited in Edinburgh. A shot at the Future Healers International program, a chance to become a doctor and change his life. 3 rows ahead, in the soft glow of first class, a sharp cry shattered the quiet. "I can't breathe." The woman's voice was tight with panic, cutting through the drone of the engines like a blade. Jeremiah's head snapped up, his dark eyes narrowing as he leaned forward, trying to see past the rows of seats. The cabin lights were low, casting long shadows, but he could make out a woman clutching her chest, her face pale and slick with sweat. A man in a sharp suit hovered over her, his voice loud and frantic. "Someone help her, please. She needs help." Flight attendants hurried down the aisle, their steps quick but controlled, their faces tight with worry they tried to hide. Jeremiah's fingers dug into the armrests, his mind racing. He knew those symptoms: shortness of breath, chest pain, a pale face. He'd seen them before, not in some fancy classroom, but in his grandmother's eyes during a terrifying night last year when her breathing turned shallow and her lips went blue. His gut screamed one thing. This wasn't just nerves or altitude. This was serious. But doubt clawed at him. He was just a kid, a black teenager in a faded hoodie and worn jeans. Who'd listen to him up here, surrounded by people who never gave him a second glance? In first class, Charles Bennett gripped his wife Sophia's hand, his knuckles white against her pale fingers. At 58, Charles was a man who commanded boardrooms and built a financial empire from nothing. His tailored suit and gleaming watch screamed success, the kind that made people jump when he spoke. But now, as Sophia's lips took on a faint blue tint, all his money and power felt useless. Sophia, 43 and stunning even in distress, pressed a hand to her rounded belly, 28 weeks pregnant, a miracle after years of heartbreak and failed treatments. Every gasp she took seemed to pull less air, her green eyes wide with fear. "I'm not a doctor." Charles barked at a flight attendant fumbling with a red emergency kit. "There's got to be someone on this plane who is." The attendant, a woman with a name tag reading Mary, nodded quickly, her voice steady but urgent over the intercom. "Is there a medical professional on board? Please come to first class immediately." Her eyes swept the first-class cabin, then darted briefly to business class, but never landed on economy, where Jeremiah sat, his heart pounding like a drum. He could feel the weight of being invisible. Nobody expected a kid like him to know anything useful. But Sophia's gasps were growing weaker, and Charles's voice broke as he pleaded, "She's everything to me. Please." Jeremiah's mind flashed to his grandmother, Martha, who'd raised him since his mom passed from cancer 3 years ago. At 73, Martha was tough as nails, but her lungs were weak, her heart weaker. Jeremiah had learned to spot trouble: swollen legs, racing pulse, labored breathing, because her life depended on it. He'd spent nights poring over medical books, teaching himself what doctors in their neighborhood rarely had time to explain. Now, those same symptoms were unfolding in front of him: shortness of breath, chest pain, a pregnant woman. His brain clicked into place. Pulmonary embolism, he thought. A blood clot in the lungs, made worse by pregnancy and long flights. Dangerous. Deadly if untreated. The cabin buzzed with nervous murmurs. Passengers stirred, some rubbing sleep from their eyes, others craning their necks to see the drama unfolding. Mary and another attendant hovered over Sophia, trying to secure an oxygen mask over her face, but Sophia pushed it away, gasping. "It's not working." Charles's face was a mask of terror, his gray eyes darting between his wife and the crew. "Do something," he shouted, his voice cracking like glass. Jeremiah's breath caught. He could stay quiet, blend into the background like he always did when people looked past him. It'd be easier, safer. But Martha's voice echoed in his head. "Knowledge is a gift, Jeremiah. Use it when it counts." His hand shot up before he could talk himself out of it, his voice louder than he felt. "I'm not a doctor," he said, standing in the aisle, "but I think I know what's wrong." Heads turned, eyes widened, some curious, some skeptical. Mary froze, her gaze landing on the skinny teenager in the frayed hoodie, his backpack slung over one shoulder. Her training screamed to wait for a real doctor, someone with a degree, not a kid who looked like he belonged anywhere but here. "We need a medical professional," she started, her voice firm, but Jeremiah's steady gaze held hers, and something in his tone made her pause. The cabin seemed to hold its breath, waiting for what this boy could possibly say next. 8 hours before the plane's engines roared to life, Charles Bennett stepped out of a sleek black SUV onto the rain-slicked pavement outside O'Hare International Airport. His polished leather shoes, worth more than most people's weekly pay, gleamed under the terminal's fluorescent lights. At 58, Charles carried himself with the kind of confidence that came from building a financial empire from scratch. Doors open for him, always had, always would. Today, though, his sharp gray eyes were clouded with worry as he gently guided his wife, Sophia, from the car. "Easy, love," he murmured, his arms steady around her waist. Sophia, 43, glowed despite the drizzle, her blonde hair tucked neatly under a stylish scarf. Her pregnancy, at 28 weeks, rounded her frame, giving her a softness that contrasted her usual polished elegance. After 3 miscarriages and years of fertility treatments, this baby was their miracle, a fragile hope they barely dared to trust. "I'm fine, Charles," she said, her voice firm but tired, one hand resting on her belly. "Dr. Larson said it's safe to fly in the 2nd trimester. I want to be there when you get your award in Edinburgh." Charles nodded, but his jaw tightened. The humanitarian award from the Global Finance Summit was a big deal, recognition for the medical center his foundation was building in Uganda. But right now, all he could think about was Sophia and the baby. "First class all the way," he said, more to himself than her. "Private car in Edinburgh, doctor on call. I've got it covered." Sophia smiled, rolling her eyes. "You always do, Mr. Planner. That's why they're giving you that award, isn't it?" As their driver unloaded sleek, matching luggage, neither noticed the yellow taxi pulling up a few cars back. Jeremiah Carter climbed out, his lanky frame hunched against the rain. He fished crumpled bills from his pocket, wincing as he handed nearly all his cash to the driver. $20 left. That was it, his emergency money, pressed into his hand by his grandmother, Martha, that morning. "You're gonna shine, baby," she told him, her voice raspy but fierce as she straightened his collar with trembling hands. At 73, Martha was a force, even with an oxygen tube snaking under her nose and a heart that faltered too often. Her faith in him was the only thing stronger than her illnesses. Jeremiah slung his battered backpack over his shoulder, the weight of it familiar but heavy. This trip to Edinburgh for the Future Healers International program wasn't just a dream, it was everything. The program picked only 50 high school students worldwide, and Jeremiah had earned his spot with a letter from his biology teacher calling him a rare talent, with a gift for medicine you can't teach. But the partial scholarship didn't cover airfare, a cheap hotel, or meals. He'd scraped together the money from years of birthday cash, odd jobs, and the small life insurance policy his mom left when cancer took her 3 years ago. Every penny was a bet on a future where he could lift Martha out of their drafty Bronzeville apartment, where the heat flickered and the landlord ignored the broken elevator. Inside the bustling terminal, Jeremiah clutched his printed boarding pass, his palms sweaty. He'd never left Chicago, never flown, never felt so out of place. People moved around him, their eyes sliding past like he was invisible. A security guard watched him a little too closely, and a woman pulled her kid tighter as he passed. Jeremiah was used to it, the way people assumed things about him before he opened his mouth. But today stung more. Today was about his brain, his potential, not the assumptions tied to his skin or his worn clothes. He glanced up and caught sight of Charles and Sophia at the first-class check-in counter. The staff snapped to attention, all smiles and quick service, as Charles handed over their passports. Sophia leaned on his arm, her pregnancy obvious even from a distance. Jeremiah watched for a moment, then turned toward the long economy line, his heart thumping with a mix of nerves and excitement. He had no idea their paths would crash together in a way none of them could predict. In the first-class lounge, Charles scrolled through emails on his phone, his mind half on work, half on Sophia. She sat across from him, flipping through a pregnancy magazine, her fingers lingering on her belly. "Braxton Hicks again," she said softly, wincing as a small ache rippled through her. "Just my body practicing, right?" Charles looked up, his brow furrowing. "Want me to call Dr. Larson?" Sophia shook her head, forcing a smile. "It's normal, Charles. I'm fine." But Charles wasn't so sure. The Uganda Medical Center, his big philanthropy project, had started as a tax move, but Sophia's passion had turned it into something real. She'd poured her heart into it, maybe to fill the empty space left by years without a child. Now, with her baby so close, every twinge she felt sent a jolt through him. A lounge attendant approached, her voice smooth. "Mr. Bennett, we'll board your flight soon. May I escort you to the gate?" Charles nodded, helping Sophia to her feet, his hand lingering protectively on her back. Across the terminal, Jeremiah shuffled through the economy line, his flashcards tucked into his hoodie pocket. He whispered to himself, "Pulmonary embolism, sudden shortness of breath, chest pain, rapid pulse." He flipped to the next card, unaware that those words would soon mean the difference between life and death. As he moved toward the gate, the weight of his dreams and the sacrifices behind them pushed him forward, straight into a moment that would change everything. The plane had been airborne for nearly an hour, climbing through the darkening sky as the last streaks of dusk faded beyond the oval windows. The cabin was a cocoon of soft hums and muted lights, a strange in-between world where time seemed to pause. In economy, Jeremiah Carter sat wedged between a snoring businessman who'd claimed both armrests and an elderly woman dozing against the window. His long legs ached in the cramped space, but he barely noticed. His eyes were fixed on the flashcard in his hand, the words pulmonary embolism scrawled in his careful handwriting. He mouthed the symptoms silently, shortness of breath, chest pain, rapid pulse, his mind buzzing with the dream that had brought him here. The Future Healers International program in Edinburgh. A chance to prove he could be a doctor, to build a life where he and his grandmother, Martha, didn't have to count every penny for her meds or worry about a landlord who never fixed the heat. Jeremiah shifted, trying not to jostle his sleeping seatmates. The air smelled faintly of recycled coffee and airline pretzels, and the overhead lights cast a dim glow over his worn hoodie. He pulled another flashcard from his pocket, whispering, "Hypoxemia, low oxygen in the blood." Every word was a step toward a future where he could lift Martha out of their Bronzeville apartment, where the broken elevator trapped her on the 5th floor. At 73, her lungs were weak from COPD, her heart unsteady, and Jeremiah had become her nurse, her advocate, her everything since his mom's death 3 years ago. He'd learned to check her pulse, manage her oxygen tank, and spot trouble before it turned into a hospital visit. Those nights of study, hunched over library books, had gotten him this far, onto a plane, across an ocean, toward a scholarship that could change everything. In first class, a world away from Jeremiah's cramped seat, Charles Bennett adjusted the recline of his spacious pod. The soft leather creaked under him, and a glass of champagne sat untouched on the tray beside him. Across the aisle, Sophia Bennett flipped through a pregnancy magazine, her fingers lingering on her rounded belly. At 28 weeks, the baby was a quiet promise, a miracle after years of loss. But a faint ache in her lower back nagged at her, and a subtle tightness in her chest made her shift uncomfortably. "Just Braxton Hicks," she murmured to herself, brushing it off as her body practicing for motherhood. She didn't want to worry Charles, who'd been watching her like a hawk since they boarded. Charles glanced up from his phone, where emails from his Chicago office piled up. His financial empire never slept, but his focus was on Sophia. "You okay, sweetheart?" he asked, his deep voice soft with concern. Sophia smiled, her green eyes warm. "Just restless. This seat's comfier than our couch, but I can't get settled." Charles frowned, his hand brushing hers. "If you feel anything off, you tell me. Dr. Larson's number is on speed dial." She nodded, squeezing his fingers. "Stop worrying. I'm fine." The divide between their worlds was stark. In first class, the air smelled of fresh coffee and warm towels, and the attendants moved with quiet efficiency, offering sparkling water to Sophia and a refill to Charles. In economy, Jeremiah felt the weight of being unseen. He slipped his flashcards back into his hoodie and stood, stretching his legs in the narrow aisle. He wandered toward the rear galley, with a soft glow of lights offered a break from his cramped row. A flight attendant, her name tag reading Mary, looked up from organizing a beverage cart. Her graying hair was pulled back, and her eyes crinkled with kindness. "You should get some rest, Han," she said, her voice warm. "Long flight ahead." "Yes, ma'am," Jeremiah replied, his politeness automatic, drilled into him by Martha. "Just a little nervous. First time flying." Mary chuckled, her hands pausing on a stack of plastic cups. "Transatlantic's a big first trip. Where you headed?" Jeremiah hesitated, then said, "Edinburgh. Got an interview for a medical program. For kids who want to be doctors." Mary's eyebrows lifted, a flicker of surprise giving way to approval. "Well, that's something. My grandson's your age, but he's glued to his video games. Good for you, chasing something real." Jeremiah's cheeks warmed at the rare praise from a stranger. "Thank you, ma'am." A call light pinged, and Mary sighed, glancing at the panel. "Duty calls. Probably someone in first class wanting more champagne." She winked, pushing her cart forward. Jeremiah watched her go, his mind drifting to the people up front. People like the couple he'd seen at the airport, all polished and carefree. What do they worry about? Not how to stretch $20 for 2 days in Edinburgh, that was for sure. Back in first class, Sophia shifted again, the ache in her back sharper now. She pressed a hand to her chest, feeling an odd pressure she couldn't quite place. "Charles," she whispered, not wanting to alarm him if he'd dozed off. He hadn't. His eyes snapped open, years of high-stakes deals making him alert in an instant. "What's wrong?" he asked, leaning closer. "Just a little breathless," she said, trying to sound casual. "Probably just need water." But her voice trembled, and Charles's hand was already on the call button, his face tight with worry. As Mary's cart rattled toward first class, Jeremiah slipped back to his seat, squeezing past the snoring businessman. He pulled out another flashcard, unaware that the symptoms he was studying would soon become terrifyingly real. In the quiet of the cabin, with the planes slicing through the night, 2 worlds, one of wealth, one of struggle, were hurtling toward a collision none of them could see coming. And then, a sharp gasp from Sophia broke the silence. Her voice faint but piercing. "Charles, something's wrong." The cabin lights flickered as Sophia Bennett's gasps grew sharper, each breath a struggle that echoed through the hushed plane. At 35,000 feet, the transatlantic flight from Chicago to Edinburgh had turned into a battlefield, and the enemy was invisible, a threat no one but Jeremiah Carter seemed to recognize. In first class, Charles Bennett clutched his wife's hand, his face pale under the soft glow of the overhead lights. Sophia's lips were tinged blue, her eyes wide with fear as she pressed a hand to her chest. "Charles," she whispered, her voice barely audible, "it hurts." Charles's voice cracked as he shouted, "Do something," at the flight attendant, Mary, who hovered over Sophia with an oxygen mask. The mask dangled uselessly. Sophia kept pushing it away, gasping, "It's not helping." Mary's hands shook as she rummaged through the red emergency kit, her calm facade crumbling. "We're looking for a doctor," she said, her voice tight over the intercom. Is there a medical professional on board? Please, we need help now. In economy, Jeremiah Carter's heart pounded like a drum. The murmurs rippling through the cabin. Pregnant woman, first class, can't breathe, hit him like a jolt. He knew those symptoms. He'd seen them in his grandmother, Martha, during a terrifying night last year when her lungs betrayed her. Shortness of breath, chest pain, blue lips, a pulmonary embolism, a blood clot choking the lungs. And Sophia's pregnancy made it even more dangerous. He'd read how air travel and pregnancy could turn a clot deadly. His fingers gripped the flashcard in his pocket, the words blurring as his mind raced. He was just a 17-year-old kid from Bronzeville, not a doctor. Would anyone listen to him? Would they trust a black teenager in a faded hoodie? The plane hummed on, but the air felt thick with panic. Passengers stirred, some whispering, others craning their necks to see the drama unfolding in first class. Mary's colleague, another attendant, rushed past Jeremiah's row, carrying a second medical kit. "Is there a doctor anywhere?" she called, her eyes scanning economy, but skipping over Jeremiah, as if he couldn't possibly have answers. The dismissal stung, but Sophia's weakening gasps pushed Jeremiah past his doubts. Martha's voice echoed in his head. "Use your gift when it counts, baby." He stood, his lanky frame unsteady in the narrow aisle, and raised his hand. "I'm not a doctor," he said, his voice louder than he felt, "but I think she has a pulmonary embolism." Mary spun toward him, her eyes narrowing at the sight of a teenager in worn jeans. "We need a medical professional," she started, but Jeremiah didn't back down. "It's a blood clot in her lungs," he said, stepping forward. "Pregnancy makes it 5 times more likely, especially on a long flight. Is her leg swollen? Is she gasping between words?" Mary hesitated, caught off guard by his confidence. A sharper cry from Sophia cut through the cabin, and Mary's resolve wavered. "Come with me," she said briskly, "but if you're wrong—" "I hope I am," Jeremiah interrupted, his voice steady as he followed her toward first class. The curious stares of passengers burned into him, some skeptical, others confused. He felt the weight of their doubts, but pushed it aside, focusing on the woman fighting for air. In first class, chaos reigned within the plush seats. Sophia lay reclined in her pod, her face ashen, her breath shallow and fast. Charles hovered beside her, his tailored suit rumpled, his gray eyes wild with fear. "Who's this?" he demanded as Jeremiah approached, his tone sharp with suspicion. "Where's the doctor?" Mary explained quickly. "No doctors come forward, sir. This young man says he knows what's happening." Charles's gaze raked over Jeremiah, his hoodie, his youth, his skin, and his jaw tightened. Under normal circumstances, he wouldn't trust this kid to fetch his coffee, let alone save his wife's life. But Sophia's hand trembled in his, and desperation won out. "What's wrong with her?" he asked, his voice a mix of command and plea. Jeremiah swallowed hard, ignoring the skepticism in Charles's stare. He knelt beside Sophia, his voice gentle but firm. "Ma'am, do you have pain or swelling in one leg? Maybe it started before the flight." Sophia nodded weakly, pointing to her left calf. "Since yesterday," she gasped. "Thought it was just pregnancy." Jeremiah's heart sank, another piece of the puzzle clicking into place. He turned to Mary. "We need to elevate her legs and get oxygen on her properly. Do you have aspirin in the kit? It's a blood thinner. Check for heparin too. Some plain kits have it." Mary exchanged a glance with her colleague, then nodded. "I'll check. Emily, tell the captain we might need to divert." She moved quickly, digging through the kit while Jeremiah helped reposition Sophia, his hand steady despite the chaos. "The clot's likely in her leg," he explained, keeping his eyes on Sophia to calm her. "Sometimes it breaks loose and hits the lungs. The aspirin will help stop it from growing until we get you to a hospital." Charles watched, stunned, as this teenager took charge with a quiet authority that didn't match his age. "How do you know this?" he asked, his voice softer now, almost awed. Jeremiah met his gaze briefly. "My grandma, sir. She's got lung and heart problems. I had to learn to keep her safe." He turned back to Sophia, adjusting the oxygen mask gently. "Try slow breath, ma'am. We're going to get you through this." As the plane banked slightly, the captain's voice crackled over the intercom, announcing a diversion to Shannon, Ireland, for a medical emergency. Sophia's breathing eased faintly with the oxygen, but her eyes still flickered with fear. Jeremiah stayed by her side, his calm voice a lifeline in the storm, while Charles's world hung on the edge, waiting for the wheels to touch down. The plane tilted slightly, its engines roaring as it began its descent towards Shannon, Ireland, the nearest airport with a hospital equipped for Sophia Bennett's crisis. At 35,000 feet, the cabin was a pressure cooker of tension, the hum of worried voices mixing with the steady drone of the aircraft. Jeremiah Carter knelt beside Sophia in first class, his steady hands adjusting the oxygen mask over her pale face. Her breaths were still shallow, each one a fight, but the faint blue tint on her lips had softened slightly. "Slow and easy, ma'am," Jeremiah said, his voice calm despite the chaos around him. "We're almost there." Sophia's green eyes locked onto his, wide with fear but clinging to his words like a lifeline. Her hand rested on her pregnant belly, the 28-week miracle she and Charles Bennett had fought so hard for. Charles stood close, his tailored suit rumpled, his gray eyes darting between his wife and the teenager who'd stepped into a role no one else could fill. "Is she going to be okay?" he asked, his voice raw, stripped to the commanding tone he usually wielded. Jeremiah glanced up, meeting Charles's gaze. "The oxygen's helping, sir. The aspirin's keeping the clot from getting worse. But she needs a hospital, fast." He kept his tone steady, drawing on the countless nights he'd stayed calm for his grandmother, Martha, when her lungs or heart acted up in their Bronzeville apartment. At 17, Jeremiah had no medical degree, but he'd learned to act under pressure, to push down fear and focus on what needed doing. The flight attendant, Mary, hovered nearby, her hands clutching a portable fetal monitor from the emergency kit. "The baby's heart rate is high," she said, her voice tight as she showed Jeremiah the readings. He nodded, his mind racing through the medical books he'd studied. "That's stress from the clot," he said. "Keep the oxygen steady and elevate her legs a bit more." Mary followed his instructions, her earlier skepticism replaced by a grudging trust. The other attendant, Emily, relayed updates to the captain, her voice low but urgent over the radio. Passengers whispered in the dim cabin, their faces a mix of worry and curiosity. The plane's intercom crackled, the captain's voice steady but serious. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're making an emergency landing in Shannon due to a medical situation. Please remain seated and follow the crew's instructions." The words sent a fresh wave of murmurs through the plane, but Jeremiah barely heard them. He kept talking to Sophia, his voice soft but firm. "My grandma says panic steals the air you need. So let's stay calm together. You and me and your baby." Charles watched, his hands trembling as he gripped the armrest of Sophia's seat. This kid, this teenager he'd barely glanced at before, was holding his world together. He'd judged Jeremiah in an instant on sight, assuming he had nothing to offer. Now that snap judgment felt like a weight in his chest, heavy with shame. "Thank you," he said quietly, the words catching in his throat. Jeremiah nodded without looking up, his focus on Sophia. "Don't thank me yet, sir. We're not there." The plane's descent felt endless, the cabin lights flickering as the wheels finally screeched against the runway in Shannon. Paramedics were waiting, their boots pounding up the jet bridge as soon as the door opened. Jeremiah stepped back, giving them space as they swarmed Sophia's seat, their voices clipped and professional. "Female, 43, 28 weeks pregnant, suspected pulmonary embolism," Mary reported, glancing at Jeremiah for confirmation. He nodded, his heart still racing. "She took one aspirin, been on oxygen for about 20 minutes. The paramedics moved quickly, transferring Sophia to a stretcher. Charles followed, his face etched with fear as he held her hand. "I'm right here, sweetheart," he murmured, his voice breaking. Sophia managed a weak nod, her eyes flickering toward Jeremiah. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Jeremiah ducked his head, suddenly shy under her gratitude. As the paramedics rushed Sophia out. The cabin erupted in quiet chatter. Passengers stared at Jeremiah, some with awe, others with lingering doubt. Mary touched his arm gently. "You did good, kid," she said, her eyes warm but tired. "You might have saved her." Jeremiah shrugged, his backpack heavy on his shoulder. "Just did what I could, ma'am." But his mind was elsewhere. On the interview he was supposed to have in Edinburgh tomorrow, now impossible with the plane grounded in Shannon. At University Hospital Shannon, the fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as Sophia was wheeled into emergency care. Doctors swarmed, their voices a blur of medical terms Jeremiah recognized from his books. A lead doctor, his accent crisp, approached Charles in the waiting area. "Your wife's stable for now," he said. "The aspirin and oxygen bought critical time. We're starting anticoagulants to dissolve the clot, but the next 24 hours are key, especially for the baby." Charles nodded, his shoulders sagging with relief and exhaustion. He glanced at Jeremiah, who stood a few feet away, looking younger under the harsh hospital lights. "You knew what it was," Charles said, his voice low. "Ow!" Jeremiah shifted, uncomfortable with the attention. "My grandma, sir. She had a clot last year. I learned to spot it." Charles's eyes softened, a flicker of respect breaking through his earlier doubts. "What's your name, son?" "Jeremiah Carter," he replied, his voice quiet but steady. Charles extended a hand, his grip firm. "I'm Charles Bennett." "Thank you, Jeremiah." The teenager nodded, his thoughts drifting to the Future Healers program. He'd missed his shot at the scholarship, his one chance to escape the grind of Bronzeville. But as he looked at Charles's grateful face, he wondered if this moment, this life he'd helped save, was worth more than any interview. In the sterile hospital corridor, with Sophia fighting for her life, Charles's next question hung in the air, heavy with possibility. "Why were you going to Edinburgh?" The waiting room at University Hospital Shannon was a stark contrast to the chaos of the plane, its fluorescent lights casting a cold, unyielding glow over scuffed plastic chairs and a vending machine humming in the corner. Jeremiah Carter sat a few seats away from Charles Bennett, his lanky frame slouched with exhaustion. His faded hoodie seemed out of place in the sterile space, but his dark eyes stayed alert, fixed on the double doors where doctors had taken Sophia Bennett hours ago. At 17, Jeremiah was used to waiting, for test results, for Martha's breathing to steady, for a world that rarely gave him a fair shot. But this wait, for a stranger he'd helped save, felt heavier. Charles clutched a paper cup of vending machine coffee, the liquid cold and untouched. His tailored suit was creased, his polished exterior unraveling after the terror of nearly losing Sophia and their unborn child. At 58, he was a man who thrived on control, but tonight, control had slipped through his fingers. His gray eyes drifted to Jeremiah, the teenager who'd stepped up when no one else could. In the harsh hospital light, Jeremiah looked younger, barely more than a kid, yet his calm authority on the plane had been anything but childish. Charles's earlier snap judgment, dismissing him based on his clothes, his youth, his skin, gnawed at him now, a quiet shame he couldn't shake. "You should rest," Charles said, breaking the silence, his voice rough with fatigue. "Nothing more we can do tonight." Jeremiah glanced up, shadows under his eyes. "I'm okay, sir. Want to know she's all right." Charles nodded, a lump rising in his throat. This kid had no tie to Sophia, no reason to sit here at 2 a.m. in a foreign country. Yet here he was, his missed interview in Edinburgh a sacrifice he hadn't complained about once. Charles cleared his throat, searching for a way to bridge the gap between them. "That program in Edinburgh," he said, "tell me about it." Jeremiah straightened slightly, a spark flickering in his tired eyes. "It's called Future Healers International," he said, his voice quiet but proud. "They pick 50 high school kids from around the world who want to be doctors. Top 10 get full college scholarships. My interview was supposed to be today." His tone stayed even, but the weight of it was hung heavy. Charles's brow furrowed. "And you're missing it because of us." "It wasn't a question." Jeremiah shrugged, his gaze dropping to the floor. "Some things matter more. My grandma, Martha, she'd say the same." The mention of his grandmother, stirred something in Charles, a memory of Jeremiah's words on the plane. I had to learn to keep her safe. He leaned forward, curious despite himself. Your grandmother. You take care of her? Jeremiah nodded, his voice matter of fact, not seeking pity. She's got COPD, heart problems, arthritis getting worse. Been looking after her since my mom passed 3 years ago. Cancer. He paused, his fingers tracing the edge of his backpack. Just the two of us now. Our neighborhood's not big on doctors, so I learned what I could. How to check her pulse, manage her meds, spot trouble early. Charles listened, his coffee cup forgotten. This wasn't just a kid who'd memorized a textbook. This was someone who'd grown up fast, carrying burdens most adults would buckle under. You learned all that for her, Charles said, more to himself than Jeremiah. That's why you knew what was wrong with Sophia. Jeremiah gave a small nod. Had to. Grandma says I've got a gift for it. She works hard, takes in sewing, even with her hands hurting, so I can study. That program was my shot to make it worth it, to get us out of Bronzeville. His voice stayed steady, but Charles caught the flicker of disappointment beneath it. The weight of that sacrifice hit Charles hard. He'd spent his life measuring people by their resumes, their connections, their appearance. On the plane, he'd written Jeremiah off in a heartbeat, assuming he had nothing to offer. Now, sitting in this sterile waiting room, he saw a young man who'd shouldered more at 17 than Charles ever had. I got you wrong, Charles admitted, the words spilling out before he could stop them. On the plane, I didn't think you could help. Jeremiah's eyes met his, calm and unflinching. I know, sir, he said, no anger in his voice, just a quiet resignation. I'm used to it. The simplicity of the statement landed like a punch, exposing a truth Charles had never had to face. Before he could respond, a doctor appeared at the waiting room entrance, his white coat crisp despite the late hour. Mr. Bennett, he said, his Irish accent clear, your wife's asking for you. And for the young man who helped on the plane, Jeremiah, was it? Both stood, the weight of the moment pulling them toward the corridor. Charles glanced at Jeremiah, his voice softer now. You don't have to come. Jeremiah shook his head, slinging his backpack over his shoulder. I want to, sir. Need to see she's okay. As they followed the doctor through the maze of hospital hallways, the beeps of monitors and muffled voices filled the air. Sophia was stable, the doctor had said, but not out of danger. The baby's heart rate was still unsteady, a fragile thread tying them all together. Charles's mind churned. This teenager had saved his wife, his child, and given up his own future to do it. What did Charles owe him? Money? Connections? Something deeper? As they neared Sophia's room, her voice faint but calling for them, a question burned in Charles's chest, one he hadn't dared ask yet. What drove a kid like Jeremiah to risk so much for strangers? The hospital corridor at University Hospital Shannon smelled of antiseptic and hope, a sharp contrast to the chaos of the plane. Jeremiah Carter followed Charles Bennett through the maze of hallways, his sneakers squeaking faintly on the polished floor. The beeps of monitors and muffled voices of nurses faded as they reached Sophia Bennett's room. Inside, Sophia lay propped against white pillows, her face still pale, but her breathing steadier. The blue tint on her lips was gone, and the monitors tracking her and the baby's heartbeats pulsed with reassuring rhythm. Her green eyes brightened as Jeremiah and Charles entered, a weak smile breaking through her exhaustion. My heroes, she said, her voice soft but warm. Jeremiah ducked his head, his cheeks warming at the praise. At 17, he was used to being overlooked, not celebrated. Just glad you're okay, ma'am, he said, shifting his backpack on his shoulder. Sophia reached out a hand, and after a moment, Jeremiah stepped forward to take it, his touch gentle. The doctors told me what you did, she said, her grip surprisingly strong. You saw what was happening when no one else could. Without you, her voice faltered, her free hand moving to her belly, where her 28-week baby rested. Charles moved to her other side, bending to kiss her forehead. How do you feel, sweetheart? He asked, his deep voice thick with relief. Better, Sophia said, squeezing Jeremiah's hand before letting go. The clot's dissolving, they say. The baby's heart rate is steady now. Her gaze shifted back to Jeremiah, softening. Charles told me you missed an interview for a medical program because of us. The future healers thing. Jeremiah shrugged, his jaw tightening slightly. It's not a big deal right now, ma'am. But the words didn't hide the flicker of loss in his eyes. The scholarship could have meant medical school, a way out of Bronzeville's struggles for him and his grandmother, Martha. Sophia shook her head, her voice firm despite her weakness. It is a big deal. That was your future. Charles watched the exchange, his tailored suit still rumpled from the night's ordeal. At 58, he'd built a life where problems were solved with money or connections, but this felt different. Jeremiah's actions on the plane weren't just skill. They were courage, the kind Charles rarely saw in his world of boardrooms and gala dinners. A decision formed in his mind, solid as stone. You need rest, he told Sophia, his tone gentle but decisive. The doctors say you'll stay here a couple of days for observation. I've got us a hotel nearby. He turned to Jeremiah. You too. The airline's covering rooms for all the passengers. I made sure you've got one. Thank you, sir, Jeremiah said, his politeness automatic, drilled into him by Martha. I should call my grandma. Let her know what's happened. She'll worry when I don't check in from Edinburgh. He stepped into the hallway, pulling out his phone, leaving Charles and Sophia alone. Sophia's eyes followed Jeremiah, her expression soft. He's incredible, she murmured. So young, but so capable. If he hadn't been on that flight, she didn't finish, but Charles felt the weight of the unspoken. He squeezed her hand, his mind churning. Meeting Jeremiah had cracked something open in him, exposing assumptions he'd never questioned. Get some sleep, he said, kissing her forehead again. I'll be back soon. In the hallway, Jeremiah leaned against the wall, his phone pressed to his ear as he spoke to Martha. Her raspy voice, warm despite the late hour in Chicago, filled him with both comfort and ache. The Future Healers program had been clear. No interview, no scholarship. At 17, this was his only shot before the age limit kicked in. He didn't tell Martha that, focusing instead on Sophia's survival. You did right, baby, Martha said, pride cutting through her cough. That knowledge you got, it's for helping folks. Jeremiah swallowed hard, his throat tight. I know, Grandma. I'll be home soon. As he hung up, he looked up to find Charles watching him from the doorway, his gray eyes unreadable. The silence stretched, heavy with unspoken questions, until Charles spoke. Join me at the hotel cafe tomorrow morning, he said, his tone more request than command. We need to talk. Jeremiah nodded, unsure what to expect but sensing a shift in the air, like the moment before a storm breaks. The next morning, the hotel cafe was a quiet bubble of clinking cups and soft chatter. Jeremiah sat across from Charles, a chipped mug of coffee warming his hands. The modest space, with its plain tables and faint smell of toast, felt worlds away from Charles's usual haunts. Charles studied Jeremiah, noting the careful way he sat, back straight, eyes alert, dignity in every move despite the worn hoodie. The airline's arranging flights back to Chicago tomorrow, Charles began, stirring his coffee. But I want to talk about what you did for Sophia. For us. Jeremiah's expression tightened, wary of where this was going. I don't need anything, sir, he said, his voice even. Charles shook his head, leaning forward. You gave up a lot. Your interview, your shot at that scholarship. I want to help. Not as payment, but because you're someone special. I can connect you with medical schools, cover your education. It's an investment in a future doctor. Jeremiah's eyes widened, hope flickering before he tamped it down. That's generous, sir, he said carefully, but there's something else I'd rather ask for. Not for me, for my grandma. Charles blinked, caught off guard. Your grandmother? Jeremiah nodded, his hands clasping tightly. She needs better care than we can get. Our insurance barely covers basics, and the specialists in Bronzeville keep passing her around. If you can help her, that'd mean more than any scholarship. The request hit Charles like a wave, reshaping his understanding of the young man across from him. He'd expected a kid to ask for money, a favor, something for himself. Instead, Jeremiah's heart was with his grandmother, his community. Of course, Charles said, his voice firm. I'll get her the best doctors, whatever she needs. But Jeremiah shook his head, his gaze steady. It's not just her, sir. It's the whole system. Our clinic's falling apart, understaffed, underfunded. People like my grandma deserve better. As Jeremiah spoke, his quiet passion painting a picture of Bronzeville's struggles, Charles felt something shift inside him. His Uganda Medical Center, the one earning him awards, seemed distant compared to the needs right here, in a city he called home for decades. What did Jeremiah want? Not just for Martha, but for everyone like her. The Chicago sun hung low, casting long shadows across the cracked sidewalks of Bronzeville as a sleek rental car pulled up to a weathered brick building. Charles Bennett stepped out, his polished shoes a stark contrast to the uneven pavement. At 58, he was used to penthouse offices and five-star hotels, not apartment complexes with faded paint and a broken buzzer. Sophia, now recovered from her ordeal in Shannon a week ago, eased out beside him, her pregnancy at 29 weeks slowing her steps. She rested a hand on her belly, her green eyes scanning the building with quiet curiosity. "This is Jeremiah's home," she said softly, as if grounding herself in the reality of the place. Jeremiah led the way, his lanky frame moving easily up the narrow stairs, his backpack slung over one shoulder. "Elevator's been out for months," he said over his shoulder, his voice matter of fact. "Grandma's on the 5th floor, so we take it slow." Charles nodded, his jaw tightening as he climbed, the creak of the wooden steps echoing in the dim stairwell. The air smelled of old paint and cooking spices, a world away from the sterile hospital in Shannon or the first-class cabin where their lives had collided. At the top, Jeremiah knocked lightly on a door marked 5B, its paint chipped but adorned with a small wreath of dried flowers. The door swung open, revealing Martha Carter, a petite woman of 73 with a commanding presence despite her oxygen tube and slight limp. Her gray hair was pulled into a neat bun, and her sharp brown eyes sized up Charles and Sophia in an instant. "Well, come on in," she said, her voice raspy but warm, tinged with the strength that had raised Jeremiah through grief and hardship. "Don't stand there letting the heat out." The apartment was small but spotless, filled with the cozy warmth of family. A worn couch sat against one wall, covered with a colorful quilt, and a table held a vase of fresh daisies. Photos lined the shelves, Jeremiah as a gap-toothed kid, his late mother smiling, Martha in younger days. The faint hum of an oxygen concentrator blended with the aroma of cornbread cooling on the counter. Martha gestured to the couch. "Sit. I ain't got fancy chairs, but they hold up." Sophia smiled, easing herself down carefully. "It's lovely, Mrs. Carter," she said, her voice genuine. Charles nodded, taking a seat beside her, his tailored suit looking out of place against the quilt. Jeremiah hovered near Martha, helping her settle into an armchair with practiced ease. "You okay, Grandma?" he asked, adjusting her oxygen tube. She swatted his hand gently, her eyes twinkling. "Stop fussing, boy. I'm fine." She turned to Charles and Sophia, her gaze direct. "Now, you're the folks my Jeremiah saved on that plane. I'm grateful, but I gotta ask, why you here in Bronzeville? What's this visit about?" Charles leaned forward, his hands clasped, choosing his words carefully. "Mrs. Carter, your grandson didn't just save my wife and our baby. He opened my eyes. I judged him wrong at first, and I'm not proud of that. He gave up a big opportunity to help us, and when I offered to fund his education, he asked for something else, better care for you, and for people like you." Martha's eyebrows lifted, her gaze flicking to Jeremiah, who looked down, a faint flush on his cheeks. "Go on," Martha said, her tone neither warm nor cold, just waiting. Charles continued, his voice steady. "I run a foundation. We're building a medical center in Uganda, but Jeremiah made me see the needs right here in Chicago. I want to start a health initiative in Bronzeville, a clinic with real doctors, specialists, affordable meds, transportation for folks who can't get around easy. I want it to be something that lasts, something the community trusts." Sophia nodded, her hand resting on her belly. "We want to honor what Jeremiah did," she added. Not just for us, but for everyone who needs help like I did. Martha listened, her sharp eyes moving between them, weighing their words. The room was quiet except for the soft hiss of her oxygen and the distant hum of traffic outside. Finally, Martha spoke, her voice firm. "That's a fine speech, Mr. Bennett, but I've seen promises come and go. Clinics open, then close when the money runs dry. Why should I believe this one's different?" Charles didn't flinch, respecting her directness. "Because Jeremiah's going to help us build it," he said. "He knows what Bronzeville needs, what you need. I'm not here to drop a check and walk away. I want this to work for real." Martha's gaze softened, but only slightly. "And you, Jeremiah?" she asked, turning to her grandson. "What you think about all this?" Jeremiah straightened, his voice steady. "It's a star, Grandma, but it's got to be ours, Bronzeville's. Not just their name on a building. We need folks from here helping run it, making sure it fits." Martha nodded, pride flashing in her eyes. "That's my boy, always thinking bigger." Over plates of cornbread and iced tea, the conversation deepened. Charles sketched out his vision: free checkups, a van for elderly patients, a pharmacy with fair prices. Martha pushed back, her question sharp but fair. "What about maintenance? Staff who stay longer than a year? You going to train local kids to work there?" Charles took notes on his phone, his respect for her growing with every challenge. Sophia chimed in, her voice warm. "We're learning, Mrs. Carter. We want to get this right." As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a golden glow through the apartment's small windows, Martha leaned back in her chair, her expression thoughtful. "All right," she said at last. "I'll back this, but only if it's built with Bronzeville's heart, not just your money. Jeremiah gets a say, and so do we." Charles nodded, a weight lifting from his shoulders. "Agreed." But as he looked at Jeremiah, a new question burned. Would this kid, who'd already given so much, be ready to lead a project this big? The morning sun filtered through the haze of Bronzeville, casting a warm glow on the uneven sidewalks and faded storefronts. Jeremiah Carter walked a step ahead of Charles and Sophia Bennett, his sneakers scuffing the pavement as he led them through his neighborhood. The air carried the scent of frying bacon from a nearby diner and the faint hum of a CTA bus rumbling past. At 17, Jeremiah knew these streets like his own heartbeat. Every corner store, every boarded-up lot, every face that nodded as he passed. Today, he wasn't just walking. He was showing Charles and Sophia the world that had shaped him, the world he wanted to change. Charles, his tailored suit replaced with a simpler jacket, kept pace, his gray eyes taking in the details: the graffiti-covered pharmacy with a flickering sign, the community clinic with a line snaking out the door. Sophia, now 29 weeks pregnant, walked carefully beside him, her hand resting on her belly, her face a mix of empathy and determination. "This is the main clinic," Jeremiah said, pausing in front of a low brick building, its paint peeling like old skin. "One doctor, 2 nurses, maybe 3 days a week. You need blood work or a specialist? Good luck. Nearest hospital's a 20-minute bus ride, and that's if the bus shows up." Charles frowned, his phone already out, snapping photos of the clinic's cracked windows and overcrowded waiting area. "This is it for the whole neighborhood?" he asked, his voice low, almost disbelieving. Jeremiah nodded, his expression calm but pointed. "Yep, Grandma's been coming here for years. Half the time, they're out of her heart meds, or the machine for her lung tests is down. Folks just make do." Sophia's gaze lingered on a woman in line, her walker wobbling on the uneven pavement. "How do people like her get here?" she asked, her voice soft. Jeremiah pointed to a rusted bench at the corner. "Bus stops there, but it's not reliable. Some folks walk, some pay for rides they can't afford. Grandma's stuck upstairs when her arthritis flares, elevators still broken." His words weren't bitter, just honest, each one landing like a quiet challenge. Charles's jaw tightened, his mind racing. His Uganda Medical Center, the one earning him awards, felt like a distant dream compared to the raw need in front of him. "What would fix this?" he asked, turning to Jeremiah. The teenager didn't hesitate. "A real clinic, open every day. Doctors who stay, not just pass through. A van to pick up folks like Grandma. Meds that don't cost a week's groceries. And staff from Bronzeville, People who know what it's like here. Sophia nodded, her eyes bright with agreement. A place that feels like home, she added, not a last resort. As they walked on, Jeremiah pointed out the pharmacy, where long lines meant hours of waiting, and the community center, where free health fairs happen once a year, if that. Each stop painted a clearer picture of a neighborhood fighting to survive a system that seemed to forget it existed. Charles listened, his notes growing longer, his respect for Jeremiah deepening. This wasn't just a kid with a knack for medicine. This was a young man who saw solutions where others saw problems. Back at Martha Carter's apartment, the group gathered around her small kitchen table, the smell of fresh coffee mingling with the warmth of the quilt-draped room. Martha sat in her armchair, her oxygen tube in place, her sharp brown eyes watching Charles like a hawk. "So, you've seen it," she said, her raspy voice cutting through the quiet. "What's your plan, Mr. Bennett?" Charles leaned forward, his hand clasped. "A Bronzeville Community Health Initiative," he said, his voice steady. "A new clinic fully staffed, with specialists on rotation, cardiology, pulmonology, whatever's needed. A van for transportation, a pharmacy with affordable meds. Training programs for local kids to become nurses, techs, maybe even doctors." Martha's eyebrows lifted, but her expression stayed guarded. "Sounds pretty. How are you making sure it lasts?" Charles glanced at Jeremiah, a spark of conviction in his eyes. "Your grandson's going to help us. I want him as a paid advisor, giving us the community's voice. And I'm setting up a scholarship for him. University of Chicago, pre-med, full ride." Sophia smiled, adding, "We want this to be Bronzeville's, not just ours." Jeremiah's ideas are the foundation. Jeremiah's breath caught, the weight of the offer sinking in. A scholarship, his dream, handed to him after he'd thought it was lost. But his focus stayed on Martha, on Bronzeville. "I'll do it," he said, his voice firm, "but only if the community gets a real say. We need a board with folks from here, parents, elders, not just suits from downtown, and jobs for locals, not outsiders who leave in a year." Martha's lips curved into a proud smile, her hand reaching for his. "That's my boy," she said, her voice thick with love. Charles nodded, his respect for Jeremiah growing deeper. "You've got it," he said. "We'll form a community board, hire locally, train locally. This isn't a one-off, it's a commitment." Martha leaned back, her gaze softening but still sharp. "We'll hold you to that," she said, a warning wrapped in approval. Sophia reached across the table, her hand brushing Martha's. "We're in this together," she said, her voice warm. "For your grandson, for you, for everyone here." As the conversation stretched into the afternoon, plans took shape, blueprints for a clinic, ideas for outreach, names of local leaders to involve. Jeremiah sketched on a napkin, his hands moving with purpose, while Charles typed notes, his usual polish giving way to genuine excitement. But as the sun dipped low, casting golden light through the apartment's small windows, a quiet question lingered in Charles's mind. Could this initiative, born from a chance encounter at 35,000 feet, truly bridge the gap between his world and Jeremiah's? 6 months after the plane touched down in Shannon, the streets of Bronzeville buzzed with a new kind of energy. The morning sun glinted off the freshly painted walls of the Bronzeville Community Health Initiative, a modern clinic that stood where the old, crumbling one once did. The building was modest but sturdy, its glass doors etched with a simple motto: "Knowledge is meant for sharing." A crowd gathered outside, families, elders, kids holding balloons, chatting over the rhythm of a local jazz band playing nearby. The air smelled of coffee from a food truck and blooming flowers planted along the sidewalk, a far cry from the neighborhood's usual grit. Jeremiah Carter stood near the clinic's entrance, his lanky frame now in a crisp button-up shirt, a gift from his grandmother, Martha, who'd insisted he look the part for today. At 17, he was still the kid from Bronzeville, but his eyes carried a new confidence. After school, he worked as a paid advisor for the initiative, his ideas shaping everything from the clinic's van service to its youth training program. Accepted to the University of Chicago's pre-med program on a full scholarship funded by Charles Bennett, Jeremiah felt the weight of his dreams taking root. But today wasn't about him. It was about the community he'd fought for. Charles Bennett stepped to the podium, his tailored suit swapped for a simpler blazer, his gray eyes bright with purpose. At 58, he was a changed man, the sharp edges of his corporate life softened by the months spent working with Jeremiah and Bronzeville's residents. Sophia stood beside him, radiant at 34 weeks postpartum, cradling their newborn daughter, Martha Grace Bennett, named in honor of the woman who'd raised the boy who saved them. The baby's tiny hand gripped Sophia's finger, her coos blending with the crowd's hum. "This clinic," Charles began, his voice carrying over the microphone, "is more than a building. It's a promise, to listen, to serve, to stay. And it's here because of one young man's courage." The crowd turned to Jeremiah, who ducked his head, a shy smile breaking through. Martha, seated in the front row, beamed, her oxygen tube discreetly tucked beneath a vibrant scarf. At 73, her health was improving, thanks to the clinic specialists who'd adjusted her meds and arranged home visits. She clapped loudly, her raspy cheer cutting through the applause. "That's my boy," she called, drawing laughter from the crowd. Jeremiah glanced at her, his heart swelling. This moment, her pride, the clinic's doors open, was worth every missed interview. Inside, the clinic gleamed with new equipment. Exam rooms, a pharmacy with affordable meds, a van parked out back for patient pickups. Local nurses, trained through the Initiatives program, moved with purpose, their faces familiar to the community. A community board, led by Bronzeville residents, ensured the clinic answered to the people it served. Jeremiah had pushed for it all, his voice steady in meetings with Charles and the architects, his knowledge of the neighborhood guiding every decision. "It's got to feel like ours," he'd said, and now it did. Later that day, the scene shifted to a Chicago hospital, where Sophia rested in a private room, the soft beeps of monitors a gentle backdrop. The naming ceremony for Martha Grace was small but warm, with sunlight streaming through the window. Jeremiah stood by the bed, holding the baby for the first time, his hands careful but steady. Her tiny fingers curled around his, and he smiled, a quiet awe in his eyes. "She's strong," he said, his voice soft. Sophia laughed, brushing a strand of blonde hair from her face. "Like her godfather," she said, her words carrying the weight of their shared journey. Charles watched, his chest tight with emotion. Naming Jeremiah godfather had been Sophia's idea, but he'd agreed instantly. This teenager, who'd once been a stranger he dismissed, was now family in a way Charles hadn't expected. "You've changed us," Charles said, his voice low, almost to himself. "Not just with what you did on that plane, but with what you showed me after." Jeremiah looked up, passing the baby back to Sophia. "You changed things too, sir," he said. "This clinic, it's more than I ever thought we'd get." Martha, seated nearby, adjusted her scarf, her sharp eyes softening as she watched her grandson. "You both did right," she said, her raspy voice firm. "But don't go getting comfortable. There's more work to do." Charles nodded, a smile tugging at his lips. She was right, always was. The clinic was a start, but Bronzeville needed more, and Charles was beginning to see his role not as a savior, but as a partner. As the ceremony ended, Charles stepped outside, the hospital's cool air a contrast to the warmth of the room. He thought back to that flight, to the moment he'd judged Jeremiah without a second thought. That Charles, detached, driven by awards and optics, was fading. The Uganda project, once his pride, had been restructured to include local voices, inspired by Jeremiah's insistence on community ownership. Here in Chicago, the Bronzeville Initiative was proof that real change started with listening, not dictating. Back inside, Jeremiah sat with Martha, showing her a pamphlet about the clinic's youth program, where he'd mentor kids dreaming of medicine. His scholarship meant college, but his heart was here, in the streets that raised him. As he spoke, Sophia watched, cradling Martha Grace, a question forming in her mind. How far could this initiative go, with Jeremiah's vision and their support? Could it grow beyond Bronzeville, to other neighborhoods, other cities? The streets of Bronzeville hummed with life under a crisp Chicago sky, the kind of day where the wind carried both the bite of winter and the promise of spring. A year had passed since the Bronzeville Community Health Initiative opened its doors, and the clinic had become a heartbeat of the neighborhood. Its clean, modern facade stood out against the weathered buildings nearby, but it felt like home, welcoming, alive, and unmistakably Bronzeville's. Inside, exam rooms buzzed with patients, from elders getting blood pressure checks to kids giggling through their first vaccinations. The pharmacy shelves were stocked, the van shuttled patients daily, and local staff, trained through the initiative's programs, greeted everyone by name. Jeremiah Carter, now 18, moved through the clinic with a quiet confidence, his pre-med studies at the University of Chicago keeping him busy but his heart tied to this place. After classes, he mentored teens in the youth program, teaching them about medicine the way he'd learned, through necessity, curiosity, and care. His lanky frame was still recognizable, but his eyes held a new depth, shaped by the lives he'd touched and the future he was building. Today, he adjusted a stethoscope around his neck, a gift from Charles Bennett, and checked a chart for an elderly patient whose smile reminded him of his grandmother, Martha. Martha Carter, at 74, was a regular at the clinic, her COPD and heart issues better managed thanks to specialists who saw her as a person, not a chart. She sat in the waiting area, her oxygen tube tucked neatly under a bright scarf, chatting with a nurse who'd grown up 2 blocks away. "That's my grandson," she said, her raspy voice swelling with pride as she pointed to Jeremiah across the room. "He's why this place is here." The nurse grinned, nodding. Martha's health had steadied, but her spirit, fierce, protective, wise, remained the clinic's backbone, her voice shaping the community board that kept it accountable. Outside, Charles Bennett stood near the clinic's entrance, his breath visible in the chilly air. At 59, he was no longer the detached philanthropist who'd once seen charity as a line on his resume. The Bronzeville Initiative had changed him, just as Jeremiah's courage on that flight to Edinburgh had. His Uganda Medical Center, now thriving with local leadership, owed its success to lessons learned here. Listen, include, stay. Charles's gray eyes scanned the clinic sign, where the motto, "Knowledge is meant for sharing," was etched, a nod to Martha's wisdom. He'd expanded the initiative's model to 2 more Chicago neighborhoods, with plans for a citywide network, each project guided by community voices like Jeremiah's. Sophia Bennett joined him, pushing a stroller where 1-year-old Martha Grace Bennett gurgled, her tiny hands clutching a stuffed bear. Sophia's blonde hair was pulled back, her face glowing with the quiet strength of motherhood and purpose. "Look at this place," she said, her voice warm as she watched patients stream in and out. "It's more than we imagined." Charles nodded, slipping an arm around her. "It's because of him," he said, his gaze drifting to Jeremiah through the clinic's glass doors. "He didn't just save you and Gracie. He showed me what matters." Inside, Jeremiah paused to talk with a young girl in the youth program, her notebook filled with questions about becoming a nurse. "You've got this," he told her, his voice steady, echoing the encouragement Martha had given him years ago. His scholarship covered tuition, but his real education came here, in the clinic's daily work, in the trust he'd earned from neighbors who once saw him as just another kid. Charles had become a mentor, their weekly calls blending business advice with something deeper, like a father checking on a son. Sophia, too, was a constant presence, organizing fundraisers and bringing Martha Grace to visit, her laughter a reminder of the life Jeremiah had preserved. In a quiet moment, the group gathered in the clinic's small community room, its walls lined with photos of the opening day and thank you notes for patients. Martha sat at the table, holding Martha Grace on her lap, the baby's tiny fingers tugging at her scarf. "You all built something real," Martha said, her eyes moving from Charles to Sophia to Jeremiah. "But don't let it stop here. There's more folks out there needing this." Jeremiah nodded, his hand resting on her shoulder. "We won't, Grandma," he said, his voice firm. "This is just the start." Charles looked across the table, his heart full. That flight, that moment at 35,000 feet, had been a turning point, not just for Sophia's survival, but for him. Jeremiah's request in Shannon, to see his community's worth, had cracked open his worldview. forcing him to face his blind spots. "You changed me, Jeremiah," he said, his voice low but clear. "You didn't just save my family. You showed me how to listen, how to see." Jeremiah met his gaze, a small smile breaking through. "You listened, sir. That's what made it work." Sophia wiped a tear, her hand squeezing Charles's. "We're family now," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "All of us." Martha chuckled, bouncing the baby gently. "Took a plane scare to get here, but I'll take it." The room filled with soft laughter, the kind that binds people through shared trials and triumphs. As the sun set, painting Bronzeville's skyline in hues of orange and purple, Charles stepped outside, his thoughts drifting. The clinic was a legacy, not of his wealth, but of a connection forged in crisis. It was Jeremiah's vision, Martha's strength, Sophia's heart, and his own willingness to change. And it was a call to others to look beyond assumptions, to see the potential in a stranger, to build something that lasts. As he watched Jeremiah guide a patient to the van, Charles wondered, what else could they achieve together in a world that needed more bridges like this one? Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us on this incredible journey through a hero's heart at 35,000 feet. Your support means the world and keeps stories like Jeremiah's, Charles's, Sophia's, and Martha's alive. If you love this audio adventure, please give us a like. It really helps spread the word. And don't forget to subscribe for more heartfelt stories that inspire and connect us all. Share your thoughts in the comments. What moment moved you the most? We can't wait to bring you more.